I have the pleasure of introducing the speaker who will have us riveted to our chairs for the next few minutes. Jack Cumming, I have met twice before, once in a leading age national meeting in Boston and once in a MLCRA, National CCRC group meeting in Connecticut. And I've been reading his work, his columns in the MLCRA newsletter every time they come. Jack has had a long career in, whoops, what's going on here?
Push the button.
Jack had a long career in the insurance industry, understands that our types of communities are in reality an insurance plan scheme in which we put a very big deposit down, which in insurance they call premium, I guess, and we're promised service and maybe some money back at the end in return. Jack is the research director of the National Continuing Care Residents Association. He has written extensively about CCRC financial and governance issues. He's a retired insurance company executive, as I said, and a fellow of the Society of Actuaries. He lives in the CCRC in California. We're grateful that he was willing to make the cross-country trip to be with us today. His back is hurting, and I suspect it might be because of sitting on that plane most of the day. What's happening here?
I think you're just hitting a dead spot.
Oh, dead? I'm not dead yet. We're grateful he was willing to make the cross-country trip to be with us today. Here is Jack Cumming to give us what he calls some straight talk about continuing care retirement communities. Jack.
Thank you. We'll see if we can keep this microphone working here. And
Get close to it.
I'm going to turn it towards you.
is that working better?
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to leave it in this thing because I fear touching it. It seems a little fragile. It's a little daunting as a resident. Last year you had gathered some people from the Attorney General's office speak to you, and they gave popular political points of view. And by way of self-disclosure, I should say, although this is billed as a keynote address, I'm not a motivator. I'm an actuary by training, and it's a little daunting as a resident to be here with people like Dick Ziegler and Bill Connor and Mitch here, who could probably do some of this as well, or maybe better, but we're going to give it a go and see how this works out with you. I think it's very, very important to collaborate with providers. And so I actually spend more of my time doing that than I do really working with the National Residents Association. And I do publish, or I have heretofore, as Will mentioned, in the Lifeline, which some of you receive if you're MLCRA members, and I hope you all decide to become MLCRA members, because we need the national organization. But I also publish in some industry places, and a lot of you may not be familiar with. I don't know, Elisa, you may. Do you get the Senior Housing Forum? So you know who I am. Okay, good. Thank you. And I want to start by thanking Will for recommending me for this, and Lauren for many long months of shepherding this and making sure that it went well, and for Orchard Cove particularly for hosting us. Isn't this nice the way they've put this together? A very nice room here. And with that, let's get some. I'd like to get to know you a little bit. So first, how many of you are providers? At least say you're a provider. You represent providers. How many residents are on your board?
On our board,
Yes.
we don't have any.
Well, okay, so you're that. I'm on the Leading Age California board, which is an interesting experience. How many of you live in a CCRC that has a strong balance sheet? Okay, you'll find this informative. How many of you don't know if there's a strong balance sheet or not? Okay, that's probably more honest. How many of you have a Type A contract? How many of you know what a Type A contract is? Okay, well, Mike knows, okay, good. That's a useful thing to know.
But you should tell what it is so that you get some hands. There are some Type A people here.
Oh, I'm sure there are. A Type A contract is a full care inclusive contract, so you pay basically the same amount. There may be an adjustment for the number of meals and things. You used to pay the same amount as you move from independent living into assisted living, memory care, or into the care center. That's a Type A contract. So how many of you have a Type A contract? Some people call that a life care contract, but that gets confusing, particularly now that Mather has given us Life Plan Community, which sounds to me like an insurance agent selling you something.
Please use the mic.
Yeah, put it closer to your mouth, please.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to make a confession here. I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint slides. So what I've done is to use this more or less like a teleprompter. And unfortunately, it's behind me, so I'm going to try to work from printouts that I have here. We'll see how this works. But you'll be able to see what I'm saying, and some people learn by listening, some people learn by reading, and so you don't have to pay sharp attention because you can always catch up here. Let's get going. And the topic that I've been given is straight talk. That's taken from a title. I think Lauren liked that because that came from a talk that was given once in San Diego that she saw on YouTube. How safe is your future? The hidden side of CCRCs. We know about the food, we know about the community, we know about the congregate living, we know about the delightful staff. We know, didn't we have two remarkable women executives talking to us today? Wasn't that something? That's something we didn't have so much in our youth. So that's a positive thing. The hidden side are the finances, contracts, and governance, and I think that's what you expressed interest in last year, from what I understand, and the reason why Will turned to me today. But before we get into that part, let's start with the good news. First, you have responsibly taken care to provide for your own contingencies of aging. You've discovered the joys of communal living, made many new friends, and perhaps even new friends. Moreover, the food is tasty, free of the burdens of preparation and cleanup, and the apartments are fine once you've completed the downside. How many would agree with that? Okay.
Yep.
That's what you like about it. Life is good, carefree, safe, and liberating. But what of finances? These elements of CCRC living are less evident. And I'm not totally happy about what I'm about to share with you. I think this is a challenge for both the providers and the residents and the state of Massachusetts. All states for that matter, but the state of Massachusetts in particular, because we're here in Massachusetts today and we're talking about Massachusetts. This talk is about what is obscure, even as that affects you. I was asked to talk about how CCRCs, these three topics, how CCRCs differ from one another, the pros and cons of nonprofit versus for-profit organizations. Leading Age has committed to the nonprofit form of organization. It goes so far that Leading Age National expelled from its membership lifespan in Maryland because they said they had too many for-profit members. And the result is that the for-profits have formed a separate organization, Argentum. I don't know what that means. I guess it's something to do with silver. It used to be called Assisted Living Federation of America. And they met last week in San Diego. I was there, and I was surprised. The exhibit hall now is almost as big as the exhibit hall at the National Leading Age meeting. So the for-profit side is growing rapidly. And lastly, what are the financial issues involved with CCRC? So we'll start with this first question, how they differ, because that's the easy one. There's a popular saying among CCRC executives that if you've seen one CCRC, all you've seen is one CCRC. And they think that's a positive. Well, it means that the term CCRC doesn't really have much meaning. And now they've adopted life plan community, but I don't sense that that has a specific. We used to talk about life care community, but that term now has become more nebulous, and it's used for other things as well. So there is no uniformity among CCRCs, and that means that prospects need to educate themselves about what they're contracting for and where they're going to live. And Will mentioned that you have a consumer guide. Dan Seeger with NACRA just led a group which is just released yesterday, a consumer guide. There are lots of Leading Age has a consumer guide. There are lots of consumer guides out there. But it's very hard for people to educate themselves. Usually, they find a CCRC that, why don't we leave the lights on a little bit? Can we have,
Just trying to make the screen.
I think it's more important to be able to see each other. I'd like to see people on play, if that's okay. I just love you all so much. I want to see you, and you were starting to disappear into the darkness. So some people cite CARF CCAC, and I used to be a fan of CARF CCAC. They use a lot of ratios and they accredit, but only about 15% of CCRCs pay the fee to get accredited. And I was sort of stunned when CARF CCAC continued to treat as accredited a CCRC Glenmore, which is in Jacksonville, Florida, when it was in receivership because it had failed financially. And when I asked Amanda Birch, who was then the main accrediting person for CARF, when I asked her, why would you continue to accredit a CCRC that's in receivership as suitable for people to pay entrance fees into, she said, well, we can't hurt our clients when they need us the most. So at that point, you have a moment when credibility disappears. That was when it disappeared for me. But so here's a posting that appeared not long ago in the agingcare.com forum. This woman asked, anyone have experience with a bankrupt CCRC? My husband and I are considering buying into a CCRC. We can afford it, but I am concerned about the financial stability of the community that we might otherwise prefer. They, meaning the provider, is a nonprofit, but they're losing money every year and operating on city revenue bonds. I guess it's a great deal for residents now who are obviously paying less than the cost of the services they get. But we could live for another 20 to 30 years, and if we buy in now, is there much assurance that they can fulfill our contract? How many of you have had that concern? None of you, some of you. Some of you are worried about it. When I asked the manager, he said that the management company would find some place to borrow more money if they need to. I know this industry has had financial problems in some communities, And then that seems to be accelerating incidentally. Does anyone know about the resolution of such problems in any specific community or have any advice for me? If we make the buy-in and pay the monthly fee for several years, I fear that we won't have the financial or emotional resources to relocate if the CCRC folds. So how would you answer this question? I think this is a question that the CCRC industry needs to focus on before they worry about whether an outfit is organized as nonprofit or for-profit, before they worry about whether the name is Life Plan Community or CCRC. They have to be able to assure the aging population that what they make available is trustworthy and can be depended on, so that the peace of mind that brought you into living here in the first place, you can have assurance that it will be fulfilled. How strong is your CCRC? Well, here you will probably all know this quote. I'll spare you the reading of it, but Charles Dickens famously had Mr. Micawber say that if you're outspending your income, result unhappy misery, but if you stay within your means, result is happiness. This is the picture. The nonprofits are required to publish their finances on a Form 990. There's a lag in getting the data, so here I've used the latest data that was available for all of the nonprofit Massachusetts CCRCs. There's a number of qualifications that go into this. We'll get into it in a minute. But the point is that what this shows from the study of 990s is that the overwhelming proportion are spending more than what their revenue is. That should be concerning to us. So that should be concerning to the industry. The industry should have groups working on these issues. I remember going in 2010, 8 years ago, and meeting with Steve Mogg in Washington and saying, gee, there's a problem here. Could we get together with some of the financial leaders in the industry to talk about this? And Steve thought that might be a good idea. He was going to arrange it, but it never happened. And so years later, I asked him what happened. He said, well, we have no financial committee. So there was nobody for you to meet with. So this issue has persisted. And here's the situation in Massachusetts, which is, to be frank, a little bleaker than that, say, in Florida or even California, which surprised me. Let's look overall. This is the total value of the industry in Massachusetts. It's a $2.5 billion industry, meaning that the total value of the commitments made is $2.5 billion. So that's a significant issue, not large like relative other industries.
This is the nonprofits alone.
This is just the nonprofit. Yes, I should say something about it. The for-profits don't share their information publicly. I learned last night that some residents do get that information from them, but they don't share that. So this is limited. But many for-profits also operate with what's called a negative net asset position, as though that was of no concern. That means that they've simply diluted the entrance fee investment to sustain the organization. That's what that means.
Yeah,
So,
Chair.
beg your pardon.
I want to say, when you say Form 990, that's an IRS form, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm not sure. I think sometimes people might not get as much as is on the IRS form, but you can look up most, I mean, the sheet that the information that we get through the Massachusetts law can be fairly scanty. But if you're a nonprofit, you can get more by looking up the IRS form.
But yes,
Yeah. So if people are getting scanty information, they can go and look up the IRS form online in most cases. That's how you found it, right?
That's right, Lauren. Thank you very much for clarifying that. So my view is that you've got to treat the for-profits like they've pleaded the fifth. They haven't, they're not, it doesn't mean anything one way or another. All it means is they pleaded the fifth. They choose not to disclose. They choose not to testify. They choose, whereas the nonprofits have made it available. And you see here that they're operating at a deficit of resources available to meet commitments compared with the commitments that they've made of roughly 17.6%. But there are qualifications. First, this is based on generally accepted accounting principles, and there's some challenge with that. CCRC's, today's accounting is not the best measure of CCRC financial strength. There may be unrecognized market appreciation in the CCRC property that an objective analysis would take into account. And there may be contingent liabilities for future resident services. Those future liabilities are often determined by a simple life expectancy rule, which is clearly flawed and doesn't differ. If, for example, it doesn't differentiate between a fee-for-service community and a community that has full care inclusive. They're treated the same. So it clearly doesn't have the effect of matching revenue recognition to the obligations that are funded. So there's a problem with today's GAAP, but that's all we have, so that's the measure that we're using here. Recently, the AICPA, there are two governing bodies for what we think of normally as CPA practice. One is the Financial Accounting Standards Board, very high level, and then there's the American Institute of CPAs, which issues guidelines interpreting the FASB codifications. The AICPA recently issued a draft guideline, hasn't been finalized yet, saying that these are monthly contracts and the residents have an option to renew the contract every month. In other words, not a lifetime contract, it's a monthly renewable contract. How many of you think you have a monthly renewable contract? How many of you think you moved in for life? Yeah, right. So that's a little concerning, and NACRA has been taking a position there, but these CCRCs, they're the clients of the accountants, and accountants are going to serve their clients, so you have to be very careful with this. Also, GAAP is on a going concern basis, and so if you get to a case like Air Force Village West, or University Village Tampa, or the CCRC in Stillwater that's going under, Stillwater, Oklahoma, it's going under before it ever opened. They took entrance fees, boom. So, but anyway, if you take them, the going concern standard doesn't really work that well. So the result is that for the insurance industry, insurance regulators don't accept GAAP. They require statutory accounting, and that's more protective of consumers than GAAP, and you can see why. They're required to establish reserves so that the contractual promises that are made are backed by adequate financial resources. Also, GAAP, as I just mentioned, does not match revenue appropriately to the obligations undertaken. And insurance companies have to demonstrate that they can meet their obligations even on a going out of business basis. So that raises this question: is CCRC living as sound as the Rock of Gibraltar? You remember, some of you may remember this old ad. And to me, entrance fees are like an insured life annuity, because a life annuity, you pay a lump sum amount, say $250,000, and then you receive a lifetime income, might be $2,000 a month or something for life. Here, you pay an entrance fee, and presumably your monthly fee is reduced by an amount comparable to what a life annuity would pay. So it seems to me that there's a direct analogy between an entrance fee and an insured life annuity. But many providers use entrance fees as though it was free cash to be used for the provider purposes at the provider discretion. The life annuities are subject to regulation, and they get a guarantee that the promised benefits will be paid. Moreover, the Department of Insurance is accredited by a national body, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. The Executive Office of Elder Affairs has no such accreditation and no record of significant enforcement such as you have in the insurance industry. So that raises this question. When you paid your entrance fee, did you think you were buying an investment security and just investing to secure the bondholders as an equity, like a down payment on a home secures a mortgage? Or did you think you were securing lifetime care and residence so that you could have peace of mind for the rest of your life? How many of you thought it was peace of mind? How many thought you were just making a blue sky investment? Well, you were perceptive. So it's not regulated as a security, but some providers treat it that way, and that's why the balance sheets come out as they do. If you Google, this was sort of interesting, Google are CCRCs financially sound? The first result has nothing to do with the topic. It's just they paid Google to have their community pop up. That happened to be V. The next four up there are based on work being done by Brad Breeding and his group at mylifesite.net. They're developing a database of CCRCs and developing criteria about what people should look for to be sure that their CCRC is financially sound. That was picked up by Pete Finch in an article that appeared recently in the New York Times, and that article was then syndicated across the country, so it appeared in a number of local newspapers the same. So all four of those, and Pete used Brad Breeding's criteria as the basis for that article. So here you see the article, and you may recognize the chap at the top there. That was the article as it appeared in the New York Times, and that's my wife up there. And we're standing on the beach. We have a beachfront CCRC. We're looking out over the ocean. They took about 100 pictures, some with the ocean showing. I don't know why they made it look like we were just standing in a sandbox, but anyway, there we're in a sandbox in front of our CCRC. And that brings us to a story, and it's my story, the story of my wife and me. There you get a picture of my wife. You've got me in front of you for what that's worth. In 1998,
she's a Massachusetts native.
She is a Massachusetts, well, not a native. She's born in Schenectady.
Oh.
But she went to Wellesley High, and then she went on to Brown, came back, and she lived on Charles Street for many, many years. When she was 40 and thought she would never get married, she decided she ought to buy a place, so she bought a condominium, 180 Commonwealth Avenue.
Whoa.
Some of you know where that is. And of course, right then, when she gave up on getting married, we met, and the rest is history. And I'm delighted. It's been a wonderful thing. But her parents moved to Rivermead in Peterborough, New Hampshire. How many of you know Rivermead? It's a wonderful place. So they were in their late 80s. We went to visit them, and we really liked it. I mean, meals, nice home, activities, care if you need it. It was wonderful. So in 2004, when our friends the Swansons started looking, we joined them in the search. So we went all over. We decided we didn't want to be cold, so we wanted to stay in California. And we looked all over that area, and it turned out that Joel had been an Air Force officer, so he was eligible to move to Air Force Village West, which now is financially struggling, by the way, which is another tale. But anyway, and we weren't eligible, so we moved to Carlsbad by the Sea in 2006. And here you see what our CCRC, my apartment's right down there next to the ocean. We love the location, we love the concept, but we were naive. We assumed that all was what it appeared to be. We assumed, or rather I did, because after all I'm an actuary, so I knew how insurance companies are regulated, and they're required to be able, they make future promises, you pay now for something you're going to get in the future, and they're required to be trustworthy. So I assume that CCRCs were similarly regulated. After all, the elderly are more vulnerable than most policyholders. But, and here's a reality check, this is taken from Rebecca Benson, who's a Boston lawyer. She's one of the few elder law lawyers who specializes particularly in CCRCs. And this is a direct quote from her, "There are no federal laws or regulations concerning CCRCs." Now that's not completely true, because in 1972, Hanson Bridget, a big law firm primarily in San Francisco, lobbied the IRS to get Revenue Ruling 72-124. And, excuse me, Revenue Ruling 72-124 maintains that merely providing housing for the elderly is a charitable act. So that opened the door. You can be profitable and be tax exempt because you're providing housing that's tailored to the elderly. So that really was when the industry took off. So that, in effect, is an enabling regulation at the federal law. But she didn't cite that. Maybe that's a technicality. She goes on to say, Massachusetts CCRCs are subject to certain disclosure requirements, but no state agency has enforcement authority over CCRCs. Some Massachusetts CCRCs charge entrance fees of well over $500,000, and the industry is virtually unregulated. Nevertheless, prospective CCRC residents do not always consult with an attorney before signing their admission agreement. When they do, they may be surprised to find what the agreement's required. How many of you read your agreement before you signed it? Good. You liked everything you found there?
It's good. It's good.
Well, here's an actual sentence. This happens to be from my sister's agreement. My sister moved into a place called Casa de la Campanas, which is near where I live. She couldn't afford our CCRC, to be frank. This is a little more affordable. But this was the provision from her actual contract. I understand and agree that at any time and from time to time, all without notice to me and without affecting your rights or my obligations hereunder, you, the provider, may alter any terms of the residence agreement or any part of it, including renewing, compromising, extending, or accelerating, or otherwise changing the time for payment of amounts due thereunder. Now, I've looked through...
That doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work. I've looked through a number of the Massachusetts contracts. I haven't found anything as egregious as that. I do frequently find in them statements to the effect that entrance fees are to be used at the provider's sole discretion any way the provider wants to,
Yeah.
and that you give away any right to question that other than through an arbitration procedure. And as some of you may know, yesterday or the day before, the Supreme Court upheld the fact that you can have a mandatory arbitration requirement in a contract of adhesion. Now, arbitration may make some sense at the point of the dispute. Both parties might agree that it's less costly and more effective to arbitrate a dispute. But if you require it in advance and have people waive certain constitutional rights for the fact of having an expedited delivery, when providers are much more likely to be customers of the arbitrations, that's a little different. How many of you accepted an arbitration, a mandatory arbitration agreement in your residence agreement? Yeah, a few of you know.
Don't know.
Yeah, okay. So, anyway, now we switch to balance sheet. Here we're looking at net worth. Net worth is the amount by which resources that are available, the financial value of the resources available to meet commitments exceed the commitments. You want some excess because there are contingencies you can't foresee. There may be a storm that comes along, that things out or something. So you want some contingency margin above and beyond on the foreseeable contract commitments of the organization. This shows how the net worth of the nonprofits, and I'm not saying that the for-profits are any better, again, that all they did was plead the fifth, in Massachusetts, as of fiscal year 2015, which was the most recent fiscal year for which I could get data for all Massachusetts CCRCs. And I've used letters here because I didn't want you to play a name game, go looking for your own CCRC. But as you can see, the industry in Massachusetts cannot be really considered to be strong. And that's a challenge that I think providers and residents should work together, because that's going to affect the marketplace. People are going to learn about this, and they're going to say, gee, maybe I should go to a month-to-month place. I don't want to risk that investment. Or maybe I'll just stay where I am, and I'll go to assisted living. I'll go to Brookdale when the time comes that I need that. There are all sorts of things that could happen. So it's in the provider's best interest to address these challenges and to find a path to capital adequacy so that the industry is adequately capitalized to make the promises that it's making. I know that's a challenge with a nonprofit format because you can't raise equity capital other than through donations. And of course, providers of equity capital like to have some accountability, and donors generally don't have accountability. But that's a problem. And here, I'm comparing the CCRC industry, which is much, much smaller than the life insurance industry, for Massachusetts, showing how the CCRC industry is operating at a deficit with a negative, what they call a negative net asset position. But if you ask some of the accountants, they'll say, well, don't worry about it because we get all the entrance fees and that provides cash, so we'll be all right for your lifetime. With how the life insurance industry is, which operates at a surplus. And this is just the Massachusetts industry. So what's to be done? I was a history major, so I couldn't resist putting up Chernevsky's book here. Some of you may know that, but most probably don't. But anyway, what's to be done? He wrote a novel called What's to be Done? We could move oversight to the insurance department. Many states regulate CCRCs in the insurance departments. The insurance departments have resources that are not available to, say, the Department of Social Services, which commonly regulates, or the Department of Aging, which regulates in Maryland, where Asbury-Gaithersburg has an enormous deficit. But in those states where the insurance department is regulating, they're not always as effective as they might be for an insurance company because they don't feel they have the statutory authority, so they would require statutory authority. But they do have resources. They have financial examiners who can go out and examine finances. They have investigators. They have people who can take over companies in receivership and operate them, bring in special masters, all that's needed. And those resources simply don't exist in the Office of Elder Affairs. You can encourage, also the insurance companies have access to this National Association of Insurance Commissioners. All of the commissioners, the regulators, are the members of this commission, which allows the states to pool their resources because CCRCs and insurance companies are technical in their nature, and that allows them to employ on a national level, apart from the federal government, the resources that they need to get on top of these things. And so the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has been very effective. Insurance is regulated at the state level. Their meetings, they develop model laws, model regulations, and the deliberative process is much more reasoned than what you encounter in Congress, where there are so many lobbyists lobbying young staff members. It's very different. and they meet 3 times a year. So here you see that from August 4th to 7th of this year, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners is going to be meeting right here in Boston. And you could go to it. Any of you can go to the meetings. Their meetings are open. You can register, go to their meetings. They have a senior issues task force. CCRCs would fall under that senior issues task force. They have not taken up CCRCs. The political will has not been there, and it's generally viewed that you folks are rich and ought to take care of yourselves. So you don't need a regulated industry. If you made a bad deal, too bad. You should have thought about it more. And that is, for example, now an interesting case in California, v. Palo Alto. The provider ran the place on the monthly fees and took the entrance fees as profit. And so the resident said, hey, no fair. Well, the lead plaintiff is a man named Burton Richter, who has a Nobel Prize in physics. And the question is, well, you have this Nobel Prize in physics, and you understand math, and you saw what the math of the thing was before you moved in. Why'd you make a bad deal? Well, they're still, they have the money to pursue the lead. I don't think that case is going to go anywhere. Anyway, that meeting will be in Boston. And the last thing here, and this is even more interesting, you could adopt a Massachusetts CCRC guarantee law comparable to the state associated guarantees for fulfillment of insurance contracts. Here's the home page of the Massachusetts Life and Health Insurance Guarantee Association. If you read at the bottom there, helping Massachusetts policyholders when they need it the most. They ensure that no policyholder in Massachusetts will lose money up to the state limits, will lose money on an insurance policy if the insurer goes bust or falls into financial trouble or is taken into receivership. And that's a very workable model. It's in place now. So I'm going to go drop down here to this last paragraph, and I'm going to read that paragraph. That's taken from the website of the Massachusetts Guarantee Association for Insurance, but instead of insurance, which I'm going to read it with CCRC so you can get an idea of how this would work. In the event that a member CCRC is found to be insolvent and is ordered to be liquidated by a court, the Guarantee Association law enables the Guarantee Association to provide protection up to the limits spelled out in the law to Massachusetts residents who are residents of CCRCs and have continuing care contracts with the insolvent CCRC. That would be a great comfort. And the pattern is there. The precedent has been set. It's workable. It's been working very well in the insurance industry. Now, the CCRC industry opposes this. We've discussed this with Steve Mott. He says, well, the problem is that would require the healthy CCRCs to sustain weak ones, so they'd be competing unfairly. That's the argument they make. In practice, what this law does is allow the industry to intervene. CCRCs don't go bust overnight. It's a slow process. The industry can intervene to require them to adopt sound practices so that they are able to sustain the financial commitments that they've made to residents. And the amount of actual losses in the insurance industry has been minimal because of the way this was structured. It gives you the same assurance that you'd have with a bank deposit, with a Federal Deposit Insurance Company, or with a pension through the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, or with a brokerage account through the Securities Industry Protective Corporation. We have no protection. We're general creditors, trade creditors, down with the food providers in the event of a bankruptcy. Now, we get to this question that I've been asked to address about with nonprofits and for-profits. And to me, it comes down to the question, taxes, to pay them or not to pay them? That is the question. So I've already told you that revenue ruling 72-124 allows you, if you provide housing to the elderly, to be profitable and yet tax exempt. So that you can call yourself a nonprofit. They like to say we're not for profit. That's not primary. And I think there is more of a culture of doing the right thing generally among the not-for-profits than the for-profits. Here you see the distribution of ownership types in the state of Massachusetts. So there are 20 CCRCs that are federal tax exempt. 2 are cooperative, which is kind of a hybrid because they often have a nonprofit for the community things, which own shares that are aligned with your residents, and 8 are tax-paying. Revenue ruling 72-124, which I keep mentioning, requires CCRCs to keep their nonprofit as a condition of their tax-exempt status. They're required to keep residents in residence, even if the residents' money runs out. So, but they're allowed to, and they have to do that out of their general revenues if they can afford it. However, they're allowed to reduce the provider burden by fundraising from charity. So many CCRCs have a charitable, a foundation associated with it, which raises money to help reduce that obligation of the providers. They're also, by that same revenue, required to operate the lowest feasible cost, but the IRS managed to interpret that as a community standard, and so there are many luxury CCRCs, hardly lowest feasible cost, and that requirement has never been observed or enforced. The not-for-profits are perceived as more altruistic, and I think that may attract some staff and executives who are inclined to be more nurturing and may go that way. They're perceived as more caring also. And many employees of for-profits, I think you'll find, are dedicated to their residents. There's some distinction there. They're perceived as giving better value, but both can't make it unless they're market competitive. So there's no evidence that the nonprofits give better value than do for-profits. The common wisdom is that the nonprofits have a higher compassion and tolerance for non-performing people and services, and so they may spend more there than what the for-profits pay in taxes to support the local communities where they exist. Although I don't know, does Massachusetts have pilot fees?
A lot of our members actually, well, some pay pilots as community-based communities, but many of them are paying profits.
Okay, so this is just because in California, there was a ruling that none of them could pay pilot fees. So there are no pilot fees are payments in lieu of taxes. So some nonprofits voluntarily agreed to pay something to the local town to keep it going.
Like a college or university.
Yeah, like a university that dominates the town would just fold if they were to not pay anything. So that amount is negotiated. And the nonprofits are often perceived as more resident-oriented, but generally governance practices like board representation, etc., as with Leading Age Massachusetts, which excludes residents from its board. So that's a typical situation for most, even the nonprofits. Some for-profits provide a financial guarantee, which is not dissimilar to the guarantee that I talked about. It's not quite as comprehensive. But Southgate, for instance, operates debt-free, and the resident entrance fees are secured by a first deed of trust. That's like a mortgage. If the CCRC fails financially, the residents own the property. So they're protected there. no nonprofit makes such a guarantee. So it's not that clear that the for-profits are at a disadvantage relative to the nonprofits. There is a mystique. Some people view profit as greed, others view it as a fair return on investment. That's a question. The biggest difference is in the source of capital. For nonprofits, donors, entrance fees, and borrowing are where they get their capital. For-profits use investors in borrowing. For-profits pay taxes, nonprofits do not. And for-profits are accountable to investors. Nonprofits have a lower standard of accountability. They do have a board, typically local luminaries. And this is where I think the real distinction comes about. I don't think the distinction is so much between nonprofit and for-profit. I think it's between people who are development-minded and looking for a quick turnaround on their money, and operators who are in it for the long haul. And a nonprofit can have a development mentality. Outfits like Greystone, Ziegler, King Brothers, these are organizations that profit from encouraging nonprofits to consider expansion and look, because they make their money on those expansions. So this distinction between development and operation goes across both forms of organization, whether they pay taxes or they don't. In a nutshell, the integrity, vision, and mindset of the provider management team are the key to a successful CCRC experience. Now, since I represent NACRA, NACRA is the National Continuing Care Residents Association. It was originally formed by state associations that thought they ought to have representation in Congress. But because I'm going to go quickly through some of this, and then we can wind it up. But I thought I ought to give you some of this. There's a false perception that all CCRC regulations must be by individual states with no coordination among the states. And that's a challenge for NACRA. As you can see, NACRA could be working with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. When the NAIC, those commissioners, adopt a model law, usually within a 3 to 4 year period, that law becomes law in every state in the union with very minor modifications. That's a way to get uniform state-level regulation across the nation. There's a false perception that national means federal legislation, so we just talked about that. We also, and this is a common problem among resident organizations generally, we have trouble finding qualified, willing leaders with the talent needed to lead NACRA. That's a very big challenge because we all came here to retire. My first love is history. I thought I was going to retire. I was going to read history books and write and talk about history. That's what I read. And I couldn't believe when I moved in. I was trained also as an actuary. My graduate school was all in history, but I qualified as an actuary. That there was none of that mentality. And A.V. Powell wrote a book in 1984 advising the industry exactly how to establish itself on a sound basis. At that time, New York State was thinking of getting into this area. They wanted to do it on a sound basis. And they collaborated with A.V. and other people and had a session at Arden House and developed laws for New York, which have been weakened since, and they've had 2 bankruptcies in New York State since they weakened the requirements. But so what's needed has been known to the industry for many, many years, and has not been adopted. But anyway, so we have that problem. We also have a lack of financial. You guys have a stronger balance sheet than we have in NACRA, in part because most people don't join NACRA. I think she was saying this morning that she joined NACRA because she wanted to find out what it was about, and just be. But how many of you are members of NACRA? Oh. Well, that's very good. That's more than we usually get. Congratulations.
But I suggest joining, their newsletter is fantastic.
I'll talk to you later.
You disagree? You're in it every month.
It's a resident organization run by residents, and there's resident politics involved in the leadership. No, that's all I'll say.
Something new.
That's true everywhere. And that's part of why it's difficult to persuade providers to have residents on a board of directors. Because for a board, you want it to operate collegially, to support the CEO, to help the CEO to succeed, and not to advocate from one point of view. So bringing residents onto a board, you want to find the people like Bill who are totally qualified for that kind of service and who are familiar with how boards operate and what the limitations are. And that's been difficult, and it's hard, and you can't blame the providers for questioning that. Anyway, this leaves us with some questions here. First, is NACRA needed? Do you need a national voice? Second, is change desirable for the CCRC industry? Or should we just stay with the status quo? The thinking of the Mather folks in advocating the change to life plan communities was that the industry simply misunderstood because of the words care and retirement. So they wanted to get rid of these, and if people just heard different words, they'd be more accepting of the industry. That was the idea, that's all that's needed, because the market share of the industry in the 12 years I've lived in a CCRC has shrunk from being close to 2% of the senior housing market to more like 1%. So although CCRCs are thriving, the market is growing, but the market share is shrinking. They're getting a smaller percentage of that growth. And to me, that would be concerning as a businessman, but it means that the industry can live within a very comfortable bubble and to have they have wonderfully inspiring national meetings. You ought to go to one. They're meeting this year in Philadelphia, so you can get there. Third, what can be done to improve aging in America generally? We're the lucky ones. We're affluent enough to live in these places. What about the people in PACE program? PACE is the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly, for lower-income people. What about the teacher who made $70,000 a year? Where are they going to be able to live? Do we need government programs, or should we encourage more private initiative? That may be a little controversial now, yes. So I tried to phrase it as, as neutrally as I could.